In 1581, in the town hall square of Vilnius, a man named Ignacy lit a fire. He was not a priest. He was not a scholar. Dominican monks stood beside him, but Ignacy was the city's executioner. His task that day was not to kill a man. It was to burn dozens of heretical books. And yet, despite performing a service the church declared righteous, Ignacy lived in social quarantine. He was forbidden from entering churches, bathhouses, or taverns. When he walked the streets, citizens stepped off the path to avoid his shadow. This is the paradox of the medieval executioner. He was the most necessary outcast in the kingdom. Without him, the law had no teeth. A judge could pass a death sentence, but without the headsman, those words were just ink on parchment. Yet, for touching the blooded flesh of a criminal, the executioner was declared unnailly, a German term meaning dishonorable or defiled. Modern media loves the image of the hooded headsman, a faceless ghoul in a black mask. But the reality of why these men hid their faces had nothing to do with spooking the audience. It was about survival, law, and the terrifying physics of social contamination. To understand the mask, we must first understand the origin of the office. In the early Middle Ages, executions were often the responsibility of the victim's family or a mob. That system bred blood feuds and chaos. By the 13th century, central authorities realized that justice had to be state-sponsored. But they faced a severe labor shortage. No free man wanted the job. The solution was grimly pragmatic. In many regions, the first executioners were not volunteers. They were condemned criminals. If a man was sentenced to death for theft or murder, a magistrate would offer a choice: the noose or the axe. If he chose the axe, he would live, provided he became the bearer of the axe for others. This is critical. The profession was founded on a legal fiction, the touch of a criminal defiles. By allowing a criminal to escape death by becoming the executioner, society simply transferred the uncleanness from the condemned to the captor. By the 15th century, this arrangement hardened into a hereditary caste. In Germany, France, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, executioners formed their own dynasties. Names like Schmidt, Sanson, or Mesterhazy became synonymous with death. They were forced into endogamy, marrying only the daughters of other executioners, knackers, or gravediggers. The mask, or the hood, was rarely a tool of anonymity. As the novelist and historian Hilary Mantel once wrote, and I quote, "Why would an executioner wear a mask? Everybody knew who he was." He did not need a mask to hide. He needed a mask to survive. Social avoidance was codified into law. In Augsburg and Nuremberg, executioners were not allowed to live inside the primary city walls or on the main squares. Instead, their homes were clustered near the municipal slaughterhouse, the leper colony, or the cesspools. In Spain, their houses were painted red, a warning signal. In Germany, they were painted a distinct yellow. These were not slums. They were quarantines. The fear was not just emotional, it was ritual pollution. In Denmark and northern Germany, the concept of defilement meant that physical contact with an executioner transferred his shame. If an artisan accidentally touched an executioner's coat, that artisan could lose his guild membership. If an executioner entered a bathhouse, the town council would order the bathhouse closed and purified. The mask, therefore, served a practical purpose when the executioner was forced into public view. Wearing a hood or a steel visor was a barrier against recognition that might lead to vigilante justice. Records from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania show that in 1677, a Vilnius executioner named Johann Rasovian was shot dead in the street. Not killed by a criminal, but by a citizen who found his proximity unbearable. Despite the shame, the job required a terrifying level of skill. This is where the mask, or the lack of it, becomes complicated. In France and England, the headsman often removed his hood before the strike. Why? Because beheading was an athletic feat. A botched execution, where the axe glanced off the neck or required multiple swings, often resulted in the executioner being torn apart by the mob. The mask, when used, such as the surviving steel mask from Portugal, dated 1501 to 1800, was not for the benefit of the prisoner. It was for the executioner's security against the families of the dead. But the mask could not hide the economic reality. Executioners were paid remarkably well, because the salary had to compensate for the loss of social standing. In Paris, the Sanson family, who would eventually execute Louis Roman XVI, enjoyed the right of havage. They could legally take a handful of goods from every merchant cart that entered the city. An egg here, a carp there, a portion of walnuts. By the 18th century, this made them millionaires in modern terms. Yet, they still could not sit at a normal man's dinner table. In Vilnius, a mid-18th century executioner earned 300 zlotys a year. To put that in perspective, a city burgomaster, the mayor, earned only 250. The executioner was paid more than the mayor, yet forced to live in a hut near the dung heap. Perhaps the most humanizing evidence comes from the diary of Meister Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg. He worked from 1528 to 1618. Schmidt was not a brute. He was a deeply pious, introspective man who kept meticulous records. Over 40 years, he executed 394 people and tortured or flogged hundreds more. Yet, in his private journal, he expressed disgust at crime and sympathy for the victims. He became a self-taught physician, treating the wounds of the poor. This was often the only way he could touch a respectable person without causing a scandal. Did Schmidt wear a mask? He had no choice. His identity was known to every child in Nuremberg. His mask was not cloth or steel, it was the invisible barrier of the law. He fought for decades to have his family's honor restored, begging the Holy Roman Emperor to declare his children clean. Franz Schmidt represents the ultimate tragedy of the medieval executioner. He was more necessary than the priest during an epidemic of violence. Yet he was treated as more diseased than the plague victim. The mask was rarely about anonymity. It was a symbol of a society that needed violence to function, but refused to take responsibility for it. Medieval societies from Portugal to Lithuania created a system of dishonorable people to handle the dirty work of justice. The executioner was the pressure valve for social rage. By dehumanizing the executioner, the community dehumanized the violence he inflicted. But the historical truth is this: the executioner was the state's mirror. He reflected the harsh reality of law. That order was often maintained by the hands of a man who could never wash away the stain of blood. When you see the faceless headsman in movies, remember the real Ignacy of Vilnius, the real Sansons of Paris, the real Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg. They lived in the filth, so that the magistrates could remain clean. And when the executioner died, they buried him outside the cemetery wall, still facing away from the living.